2023 is the 40th anniversary of Loughborough University's Centre for Research in Social Policy. To mark the occasion, we put together a series of short interviews with the Centre's leading researchers about issues you will have heard a lot about lately. They are food insecurity, the cost of living and of dying, inflation and energy prices. Joining us for each episode will be directors, senior researchers and key figures from a number of charities and research institutes who will bring a fresh insight to the conversation. And to find out more about any of the topics or the organisations featured, check out the episode description. I'm Peter Warzynski and I'm joined by Abigail Davis and Katie Schmuecker. And today we're going to be discussing the work carried out by CRSP, that's the Centre for Research in Social Policy, and by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Thank you. Abby, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
I'm Abigail Davis. I'm a co-director of the Centre for Research in Social Policy at Loughborough University, and I lead the Minimum Income Standard programme of research. I've been working on it since we first started back in 2006.
Thank you. And Katie?
Hi, I'm Katie Schmuecker. I'm a Principal Policy Advisor at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and one of the many roles I've held at JRF has been to support the work of the Minimum Income Standard. That's not my role now, but it was for a long time, and it's a piece of research that holds a very special place in my heart.
Excellent. So yeah, it'd be nice to talk about the individual institutes that you both work for. So CRSP, the Centre for Research in Social Policy. Can you tell us a little bit about a little bit of the background and what you actually do?
We're an independent research centre in that we are, and self-funding in that we basically work with organisations like Joseph Rowntree Foundation and other places that fund research, third sector, some governments, departments. And so we work with them to develop research to answer questions that they feel are important. And we've been doing that, as you said, for 40 years. We've been working with Joseph Rowntree Foundation for a long time now. They are one of our kind of really biggest supporters. I feel that it's a pretty good mutual relationship. We're very much sort of collaborating on this. And yeah, we do, in a nutshell, social policy research. Minimum Income Standard is one of our kind of key research programmes, and that is very much all about people's everyday lives and living standards. And from that, we've been able to create a whole kind of array of other research projects that are based on using that minimum income standard framework or approach to look at other kinds of situations. So we've done work with people with sight loss and with hearing loss to look at their specific needs. A colleague's done a lot of work with families with children with autism and so on and so forth. But it all stems from this sort of core grounding that minimum income standard gives us.
Excellent. And Katie, Abby alluded to the fact that you've worked together for a while now, isn't it? Sort of about over 10 years. What does JRF do, and how does CRSP feed into it?
So JRF is an independently endowed foundation. We have a mission to speed up the transition to a poverty-free UK that is good for both people and for the planet. And as part of that, we think about some of our work as providing what we would describe as infrastructure for other organisations, and the minimum income standard is a really important part of that. So we fund the minimum income standard, although as Abby says, it's very much a partnership. It's not a funder recipient, go away and do the work and just give us the results kind of relationship. It's very much about working together to get the most out of the research. But actually, we use it for policy influencing, we use it for kind of monitoring what's happening in the world, how society is changing, what it takes to have a decent standard of living in the UK. But we also make that research available to lots of other organisations. Abby's mentioned a few of the ways in which CRSP have used and built upon the foundation of MIS. We use it and build upon it in terms of policy influencing, but there is a multitude of other organisations out there that also use it in their own work, and that's a really, really important part of the contribution for us.
Brilliant. And I think it's a good opportunity now to say what MIS is. So it is the minimum income standard, and it's been going since 2008.
Yeah.
And so can you describe it? Can you tell us what it is?
Okay. Well, the minimum income standard is about, it all came from a very simple question. Back in the early 2000s, there was a lot of focus at that point on particularly pensioner poverty and also child poverty, back in the days when there used to be a child poverty measurement and an inclination to eradicate it. And there were a lot of people saying that pensions weren't enough, child benefit wasn't enough, but it's very easy to say things aren't enough. But until you know what enough actually is, it's hard to have a well-informed conversation. So this research all stemmed from a really simple question, which is how much is enough? So we had been doing some work already on what we call a consensual approach, which is bringing people together, members of the public, to think about this. And we thought this was the best way to find out what do people need in a range of different circumstances. We should ask people who are in those circumstances. So we have groups of pensioners who talk about the needs of pensioners, and groups of parents who talk about the needs of parents and children, and groups of working age people to talk about their needs. So the groups come together, they reach decisions on what's needed, they tell us why it's needed, they tell us how long things should last, what kind of retailers, what kind of outlets we should price things in to have it grounded in the real world. And through all of those conversations and decisions, we're able to build that up into really carefully into a very layered and nuanced kind of basket of goods and services that we can then price, and from that work out the income somebody would require in a particular household type in order to meet this standard.
Excellent. And I think the obvious question now is what is in this basket at the minute? And I presume that's changed over the years, but at the minute, what does it take to reach a minimum standard of living?
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, I was going to say. Well, when we do these groups, the first stage where they do most of the heavy lifting, that takes 6 hours. And we're talking about everything. We're talking about socks and teaspoons and carpets and light shades, as well as other more kind of abstract things. So in order to participate, you need to be able to access popular culture. You need to be able to watch TV, for example. But how we do that has changed over time. And so one of the important things about this research is that we redo it regularly. So every 2 years we're doing new research with new groups of people to make sure that the standard that we end up with is grounded in a world that we recognise and not one that goes gradually more and more out of date over time. It's very difficult. I mean, it sits under some broad categories, as you would expect. This is everybody's everyday life. So it's food and drink and clothing. It's about the furnishings you need in your home for it to be homely and comfortable. It's about being able to socialise, and if you have children, being able for them to be able to access opportunities and choices around terms of activities and so on, and thinking about how people live their lives. It's not unlimited choices, but this element of choice is so important for people to be able to live with dignity. One of the things that came out really strongly when we first started this work, we asked groups, we brought together lots of people to find out what they thought a minimum should encompass, because we really were keen not to impose that on people, our idea as academics, what a minimum meant. And that's really at the heart of the research. So this definition, which is that a minimum standard of living in the UK today includes but is more than just food, clothes and shelter. It's about having what you need in order to have the opportunities and choices necessary to participate in society. And for example, the reason it's focusing on income, and rather than sort of vouchers or thinking like things like that, is that if you give people constraints on how they spend or what they can spend, it can really be stigmatising. People talked about how aware they were of having to produce these vouchers at supermarkets, and you can only use it for certain things, and if you use it for the wrong things you have to put it back, and that's in front of a whole queue of people, so on and so forth. Choice is really important. So enough resource to be able to make some choices, not unlimited, but some, is really important.
So Katie, how does Ms feed into the living wage?
Well, I think for me that is one of the most influential things that has come out of the whole minimum income standard project, because basically, you've got Ms offering you sort of a budget that lots of different types of household need in order to have a decent standard of living, but to translate that into a wage level is not straightforward, because obviously there is just one wage level that an employer will pay to an employee regardless of their home circumstances. So there's quite a lot of calculation that goes on behind the scenes to get from the minimum income standard budgets to the real living wage. But what the real living wage does is basically the wage level that you would need to be paid in order to have a really good chance of being able to meet that minimum income standard, that decent standard of living. And I think that connection then through from the real living wage, which is voluntary, is paid by over 12,000 businesses across the UK. That was a sort of movement that was really growing in influence and growing in pace. And then a few years ago, we saw the government introduce what it calls the national living wage. It's like copying as sort of a form of flattery here. It's like they have sort of used that language of living wages for the national living wage in order to I think it's a recognition of the pressure that was being put on by the real living wage to push up wages at the bottom.
And what's the living wage? What's the calculation?
At the moment, the living wage is £10.90 for most of the UK. It's slightly higher in London. It's £11.95. And actually, when the real living wage was first calculated, the gap between that and the national living wage, that legal minimum requirement payment, was really quite substantial. But now, actually, the minimum wage for people over the age of 23 at the moment is £10.50. It's not that different to the real living wage of £10.90. And that's because the national living wage is now being uprated much more quickly. They've got a sort of target to meet a particular level of average earnings, 2/3 of average earnings. And that is pushing up pay at the bottom. But you can very clearly, I think, trace the path back through from that wage rise back to the real living wage, which itself is then rooted in the work of the minimum income standard. So it's, I think, easily one of the most influential things that JRF funds.
Yeah, and it's up to individual organisations to voluntarily pay the living wage, and the figure is around, it's over 12,000 sort of businesses, including some quite big names in the UK. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of who pays it at the moment?
I mean, as you say, there's sort of over 12,000 organisations paying it currently, and many more actually who are paying it in practice but aren't accredited to the Living Wage Foundation. Some really big names like Google, some big football clubs like Chelsea and Everton. There are lots of organisations, shops like Lush, which in sort of retail, hospitality and care services, some of those really low-paying sectors. There have been some breakthroughs there. I mean, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is also part of the same organisation as the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust. We run a few care homes, and we also provide social housing to a few thousand people in the York area, and we are a living wage employer. That was a challenging thing for us to do. We had to really kind of make the business case for it stack up, because we were employing so many people at below that rate. But with will and commitment, we've been able to get there. And actually, it's been really good, because what it's enabled us to do is to be a good and responsible employer, but also you get that back in spades from your staff in terms of the loyalty that they then show to you as an employer that is trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. A question about MIS. Is MIS the basket? That is the core of all the other research you do. So there is a core basket that doesn't change, but then you look at things like families with children and pensioners and things like that, and then they add to it, or how does it work?
So each demographic group, so say we're looking at pensioners, we have separate groups of single pensioners and partnered pensioners, and they draw up lists from scratch. So with blank sheet of paper, case study, Lily is 72, lives on her own in a one-bedroom flat. What does she need in order to have this standard of living? And we ask groups to imagine walking around Lily's flat and thinking about all the things that she might need. So really from the basics, from opening the front door, she needs a doormat. Why does she need a doormat? To be able to keep her carpets clean. And because the carpets are relatively inexpensive and they're going to last 10 years, that's what groups say. Don't buy the cheapest carpet, force economy, but a bit further up the range. So there's an element of choice as well. And it should last 10 years if she looks after it. And part of the looking after it is having a doormat. So then we know what quality doormat and how long that's going to last and whether or not it's washable and if it's rubber backed, because if it's not, it might slip and then it could be a trip hazard.
So much to think. Sounds like this
just
infinitely
yeah, absolutely,
complex.
absolutely.
Yeah.
We know the curtains are washable and they're eyelet because curtain hooks are faffy and fall apart. And they last 10 years as well, because once every 10 years you should be able to refresh your decor. A lot of people like to do it more often than that, but that's a nice to have, need to have 10 years, that'll do you. Lampshades, there's not a lot to go wrong with a lampshade. You should be able to have something that directs light into the room and isn't just a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. But you've got a price point up to which you can go. So maybe it's £10 per room or £15 a room. Or for some people, pensioners tend to favour something a little bit higher for the living room because that's kind of presentationally, that's what people will see. And then the bedroom is a cheaper one because less traffic in there. And that kind of thing. So it's that level of detail, and that's how they decide. And then we do all of that again with the partner pensioners, and we do all of that separately with partner parents and with lone parents, and then parents of separately aged children. So the baskets are made up of these massive amounts of information about each individual person within a household.
Okay, so moving on to how Ms influences projects and policy and things, how does it affect what JRF does?
So we've used Ms in lots of different ways over the years, and actually not just us, lots of other organisations as well. One of the examples that I think stands out to me is when back in, I think it was sort of 2013-14, just as universal credit was starting to be rolled out, there was a change to the rules of universal credit compared to the working tax credits that came before it, which meant that parents would get a much lower level of help with their childcare costs than had been the case under tax credits. So under the original design of universal credit, they were going to get 70% of their childcare costs back. That was 80% under working tax credit. And we worked with the team at Loughborough to do some analysis of what impact that would have on lone parents, their ability to meet the minimum income standard when they were working, and also what impact it would have on their work incentives as well. And what we found is that there was quite a long period of their income that would just be plateaued, and even a point where it would go backwards. So they would get a pay rise at work and they would actually be worse off in terms of the disposable income in their pocket. And so we turned that into some policy briefings. We actually made a very nice little animation about it as well, I seem to remember. And through some conversations alongside other campaigning charities as well, we were having conversations with with politicians and with civil servants, and ultimately quite quickly, I think they realised the error of that money-saving decision.
That's really interesting, because I was going to ask you how you get these things noticed.
Yeah, so I mean, that in the end was not just reversed but improved, so you now actually get 85% of childcare costs back.
A really interesting thing that I wanted to ask is, how has Ms changed over the years? What is in and what's out? Have you noticed it change more rapidly recently, or is it quite steady how people perceive what they need?
There's a lot of stability. There's a kind of core. I mean, you mentioned a core of sort of goods and services, and to a large extent there is a core that remains relatively unchanged. And I think if we think about our own everyday lives, that's not that surprising. Certainly the things people keep in their kitchen cupboards has not significantly changed, although pensioners have started mentioning air fryers now, so we'll see on that. It's too early to tell whether that's coming in or not, but it's certainly being discussed. Technology is something that's changed hugely. So when we first started, we published in 2008, but that meant the work began in 2006. So we've been talking to people for 17 years about this stuff. And back in the beginning, there were lots of conversations about whether anybody needed a mobile phone. And if they did, it was purely for emergency purposes. because that was all it was for if you were out and about, and the conversations about whether pensioners, couples needed one each, because they could probably manage with one between them and things like that. And obviously everybody now is so used to the technology, and it's an entry-level smartphone. So far, no one, the nice to have is the iPhone or the Samsung or whatever it is. The need to have is a low-cost contract mobile phone where for £7.50 a month you're getting the handset, you get an upgraded handset every 2 years, and you're getting a sort of fairly standard basic package of data and unlimited calls and texts, and then a bolt-on because people need more data now because they're using their phones differently. They're all smartphones. Everybody's using Google Maps or, you know, all these other kinds of things that we're used to. And we've recently used the MIS approach, again, another kind of spin-off related. We're doing some research with some other universities on a minimum digital living standard, which looks at what households need in order to be digitally included.
Have you managed to incorporate COVID in any of the latest?
The latest version we did was, we did research in 21-22 to feed into the 22 release, and we saw what we call a COVID effect, where we weren't sure going into it whether, having gone without lots of things around social interaction particularly, people would sort of got used to living without it and maybe go, well, you don't need to be able to go and visit people because you've got Zoom and we can do it that way, and oh, you don't need to go out as often, or you don't really need to go on holiday. But actually what 2 years without that had done was reinforced its importance for everybody. So they were more clear than ever before that you really needed these things because they understood what it was like to have to go without them. Yeah. But also, because we always say when we're doing the list, it's about the need, it's not about the cost. So it's not about what people can afford, because if you do that, you might as well just do the expenditure survey thing. So it's not about what people can afford.
MIS doesn't come up with a figure, like an income that you need to have to afford these things.
It does, but it's that way round. You do the need, and then you work out what that costs, rather than you've got this much money, what are you going to spend it on? So rather than capping it, we just say, tell us what you need, and then we work it out. So the cost then of socialising, of going on holiday, even a UK 1 week holiday, which is the most that has ever so far got into the budget, is that has risen massively because all the hospitality industry trying to recoup their losses, all the kind of hotels and businesses that were so affected by COVID, their prices have gone up massively. But that is the price now, realistically, of if you feel it's still important to be able to get away from your own four walls with your kids and have a family holiday for 1 week a year, we put in what that realistically costs. Yeah. So what it will show us, and one of the fantastic things about MIS, and I can't emphasise the importance of Joseph Rowntree's continuing support over all this time, is because we have this annual figure that's constantly being updated with new research, so we can see not only where the standard is and how that's changing or not, but also who's being left behind and how many people are falling below that standard. And we can monitor that over time because we are doing this so regularly. And that is a real, well, currently an indictment of our society, sadly. But it does show, and things like the universal credit. So Katie mentioned the difference between, we can use it to model household incomes when there are policy changes. So when there was the uplift to universal credit during COVID, that made a huge difference. And it lifted a lot of people towards the standard. It didn't necessarily get them to it, but it lifted them towards it in a significant way. Don't get me started on legacy benefits and how they weren't included, but for a lot of people, it was a good thing. And it just goes to show that policy change could be swift, and it could be effective, and it could be targeted. And we were able to show with MIS what a difference that made. Sadly, despite Joseph Rowntree and lots of other organisations campaigning vigorously to retain it, that decision didn't go the way we'd all hoped. Yeah. But it just goes to show that MIS is able to do these things. And if things do change in a positive way, we'll be able to pick that up as well. That it's not just for the bad times. MIS is useful in good times as well to show how things are getting better for people. if pensions are increased, or if child support increases, or if perhaps transport subsidy was brought in or something, you know, there are measures that can be made that would make it possible for more people to get further towards this standard.
Did you want to add something?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I think the fact that over so many years now we've been able to benchmark not just what income you need, but also translate that into how, you know, if you're entirely reliant on out-of-work benefits, how far away from that standard are you? If you're only earning the minimum wage, how far away are you from that standard? And if you were to earn enough to be able to afford that standard in full, how much would your type of household need to be earning? And what we've seen is all of those numbers kind of going in the wrong direction. Like the amount you need to earn is, you know, sort of gets higher and higher.
Is it exponentially getting higher? Or?
Well, particularly in recent years with the sort of, you know, the cost of living crisis, and also the sort of, you know, cost impacts of the pandemic that that Abby was just describing. So certainly, particularly in recent years, it's gone up. There's been a jump up. But you know, there's generally just an increase over time as well.
Can I bother you for a figure? What would be the minimum income for a family of two with two children?
So two parents with two children would, between them, need to earn £43,400 per year in the most recent figures, and that you know, that takes into account the way in which they will be taxed and also any income that they might receive from universal credit. And so, you know, we've seen those kind of earnings requirements have been going up, but what we've also seen is that the amount, you know, how close you can get to the minimum income standard when you're out of work has been going in the opposite direction. Okay. So a single person who's out of work and entirely reliant on universal credit for their income only has enough income to get halfway to meeting the minimum income standard.
So Abby, talk to me about MIS internationally.
Okay. Back in, I think 2009 was the first approach we had from a research centre that was government funded in Japan, asking us to come and share the MIS approach with them. And since then, we've added quite a lot of other countries to the list that have come to us interested in the approach. There's so much appeal to something that is citizen-led and sort of ground-up created. And the transparency that this has, the fact that you know all this stuff about how people live their lives. And so we have trained teams in all of the other countries we've worked in, so Japan and Portugal and South Africa and Mexico and others besides, to how to do what we do in the UK. But another great thing about MIS, another strength, is that it's culturally situated. So it's not a case of imposing anything from the UK into other societies. It's very much, they start like we did with talking to members of the public, creating their own definition. So we know lots of really fascinating things about if you're a pensioner in Singapore, you need to have two different sets of curtains because there's a special set that you put up at special festive times of year. Yeah. And if you couldn't do that, your neighbours would all think you were poor. We know that in Japan, a standard piece of kitchen kit is a rice cooker because rice is an absolute staple. It's with every meal. And they don't, often kitchens will not have that many rings of hob, so you don't use one of them up cooking rice permanently. You have a rice cooker, whereas for us, that would be a kind of wedding present that got left in a cupboard. So there are lots of different, all this sort of subtlety and nuance that we know about the UK, we also know about in Portugal and Japan and Singapore and all these other places. And so we have a global network of teams that we've worked with who stay in touch. It's very hard for them to get the same traction and the same long-term funding that we've had.
And I think it also demonstrates how when you start out on a project like this, you cannot possibly anticipate the places that it might end up. I think, you know, when you think back to the early days of, you know, JRF first working with CRSP to sort of develop the minimum income standard, we were thinking about things like, I mean, I say we, it's before my time, but I actually had a conversation with Chris Golden from who used to work for JRF and was the person who sort of piloted it through the first round of funding at JRF and managed the project to start with from the JRF side. And I was talking to him about the sort of the provenance of it all in preparation for coming and talking to you about this today. And you know, he was saying at the very beginning they were thinking about things like using it to assess benefit levels and think about how much you need to earn and whether the minimum wage is enough. But I don't think anyone was seriously thinking that we'd be setting a sort of methodology that would be used globally, or that it would come to be used by lots and lots of sort of charitable foundations who provide hardship funds to. There are all these strange little foundations that provide hardship funds to people who used to work in different professions. So there are ones for like the legal industry and the financial industry and military services. My personal favourite is the shipwrecked mariners. They all sort of use it as a threshold for like an income level below which you might be eligible for some charitable help. I don't think anyone foresaw that. I don't think anyone really seriously was thinking that the minimum income standard would be used in order to set a voluntary real living wage that would then become like a really important campaigning piece for sort of higher wages, but also a way in which employers can just sort of get on and do it without having to wait for government. So I think MIS has been used in so many ways beyond what was foreseen. It sort of shows us how, in my world, in the sort of charitable foundation world, we think quite a lot about, what's the theory of change for this piece of work and what kind of impact might we hope to have with it. And I think it just goes to show that you need to hold some of that stuff a little bit lightly. It is a bit of an art rather than a science, because sometimes things will become to take on meaning and be used in ways that you didn't really foresee at the start.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks to Abby and Katie for their insight. If you'd like to find out more about the research discussed on this show, check out the links in the description. And we have more shows based around the work carried out by CRSP and partners, so keep an eye out for those. Goodbye.